I never thought I'd be standing in front of St. Catherine's Children's Home at 14 years old, holding my little sister's hand so tight I was probably hurting her. Emma was only 9, and she kept looking up at me with those big brown eyes that seemed to ask the same question over and over. What's going to happen to us now? I didn't have an answer. Our parents had been gone for 6 months after the accident, and the state had finally run out of temporary solutions for where to put us. The foster families we'd stayed with were nice enough, but none of them wanted to keep 2 kids long term. It was always easier to take one child, they said. Nobody wanted siblings who came as a package deal. The day we arrived at the orphanage, I made a promise to myself that I would take care of Emma no matter what. I'd get us through this. I'd find us a real home somehow. But as the weeks turned into months, that promise felt harder and harder to keep. The orphanage wasn't a bad place exactly. The staff tried their best, and we had beds to sleep in and food to eat. But it wasn't home. It was just a building full of kids who were all waiting for something better, all hoping that someone would choose them. Emma and I had each other, which was more than some of the other kids had, but that also meant we were harder to place. Most couples who came looking to adopt wanted babies or toddlers, not a teenager and her little sister. I stopped believing that anyone would ever want us after about 4 months. I started making plans instead. In 3.5 years, I'd turn 18. I could get a job, save money, get us an apartment. It wouldn't be much, but it would be ours. Emma would only be 13 by then, so I'd have to figure out custody and all that legal stuff, but I'd make it work. I had to. Every night before bed, I'd tell Emma stories about the life we'd have together someday. A little apartment with a window box where we could grow flowers. A kitchen where I'd learn to make all the meals Mom used to cook. A living room where we could watch movies on Friday nights. She'd fall asleep smiling, and I'd lie awake worrying about how I'd actually make any of it happen. Then one Tuesday in November, Mrs. Patterson, the orphanage director, called Emma and me into her office. My stomach dropped immediately. Usually when she called kids into her office, it meant they were being moved to another facility or splitting up siblings to different foster homes. I squeezed Emma's hand as we walked down the hallway. Whatever Mrs. Patterson was about to say, I was ready to fight it. I wasn't going to let them separate us. I didn't care what I had to do. But when we walked into her office, there were 2 people sitting in the chairs across from her desk. An older couple, probably in their late 60s or early 70s. The woman had soft grey hair, pulled back in a bun, and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. The man was tall and weathered, with calloused hands folded in his lap and a flannel shirt that looked like it had seen 1,000 washes. They both stood up when we entered, and the woman's eyes immediately filled with tears. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered to the man beside her. "They look just like her." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat gently. "Natalie, Emma, these are your grandparents, Margaret and Thomas Brennan. They're your mother's parents." I felt like someone had punched all the air out of my lungs. Grandparents. Mom had told us that her parents had died when she was young. That's what she'd always said. We didn't have any family left, just the 3 of us and Dad. That's why we'd ended up at St. Catherine's in the first place. There was nobody else. Margaret took a step forward, her hands reaching out like she wanted to touch us but wasn't sure if she was allowed. "We didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "We didn't know you existed. Your mother, we had a falling out many years ago. She left home when she was 18, and we never heard from her again. We tried to find her, but she'd changed her name, moved states. We hired investigators, but every lead went cold. We thought—" She paused, wiping her eyes. "We thought we'd never see her again, and we never imagined she had children, that we had grandchildren." Thomas put his arm around Margaret's shoulders. His own eyes were red. "We found out about the accident from a news article," he said quietly. "It mentioned your names, Natalie and Emma, and your mother's maiden name was listed. It took us months to track you down through the system, but we're here now, and if you'll have us, we want to take you home." Emma's hand tightened around mine. I could feel her trembling. Or maybe I was the one trembling. I didn't know what to say. These people were strangers. They claimed to be our grandparents, but we'd never met them. We'd never even heard Mom mention their names. What if this was some kind of mistake? What if they were lying? What if they wanted to take us home and then changed their minds like all the foster families had? Mrs. Patterson must have seen the fear on my face because she spoke up gently. "I've verified everything, Natalie. Birth certificates, identification, DNA tests. They really are your mother's parents, your grandparents. They've completed all the necessary background checks and home studies. They have a farm about 3 hours from here in Millbrook County, with plenty of room for both of you. They want to be your legal guardians." "We want to be your family," Margaret corrected softly. "We know this must be overwhelming. We know you don't know us. But please, give us a chance. Let us take care of you the way we should have been able to take care of your mother." 3 weeks later, we were driving down a long gravel road lined with oak trees, their bare November branches reaching toward a grey sky. Thomas was driving an old pickup truck that smelled like hay and motor oil, and Margaret sat between us in the front seat, pointing out landmarks as we got closer to what she kept calling home. Emma was pressed against the window, her eyes wide as she took in the rolling fields and wooden fences that seemed to stretch on forever. I kept my arms crossed, trying not to let myself hope too much. We'd been disappointed before. We'd been let down before. I wasn't going to let Emma get hurt again, but when the farmhouse came into view, even I had to admit it was beautiful. It was a 2-story white house with a wraparound porch, flower boxes under every window, even though nothing was blooming this time of year, and a red barn standing tall about 100 yards behind it. There were chickens pecking around the yard, and I could see a few horses grazing in a distant pasture. It looked like something out of a storybook, the kind of place I used to imagine when I was Emma's age, and still believed in happy endings. "This is it," Margaret said, and I could hear the pride and love in her voice. "This farm has been in the Brennan family for 4 generations. Your great-great-grandfather built that barn with his own hands back in 1889. Your mother grew up here, running through those fields, climbing those trees, and now you're home too." The first few days were strange. Margaret and Thomas had prepared 2 bedrooms for us upstairs, each one decorated thoughtfully. Mine had a quilt on the bed that Margaret said she'd made herself, with squares of fabric in deep blues and purples. Emma's room was yellow and white, with stuffed animals arranged on shelves and a rocking chair by the window. They'd clearly put so much thought into making us feel welcome, but I still felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. This couldn't be real. People didn't just show up and save you like this. Life didn't work that way. Thomas was a man of few words, but he was patient and steady. He'd get up before dawn every morning to tend to the animals and work the farm, and he started teaching me and Emma how to help, collecting eggs from the chicken coop, feeding the horses, checking the fence lines for damage. Emma took to it immediately, chattering happily to the chickens and naming all the horses. I tried to stay guarded, but it was hard when Thomas would nod approvingly at my work and say things like, "You're a natural, Natalie, just like your mother was." Margaret was warm and talkative, always cooking something that made the whole house smell amazing. She'd braid Emma's hair in the mornings and ask us about our days at our new school in town. She never pushed us to call her Grandma or Nana or anything like that. She said we could call her Margaret until we felt ready for something else. I appreciated that more than I could say. She was giving us space to adjust, to trust, to feel safe. But there was one place on the farm that they told us we couldn't go. The barn. That beautiful red barn that stood behind the house like a guardian. Thomas said it was old and dangerous, that the floorboards were rotting and the structure wasn't sound. He said he'd been meaning to either restore it or tear it down for years, but he'd never gotten around to it. "You girls stay out of there," he said firmly. "I don't want either of you getting hurt. Promise me." We promised. But I'd catch Emma staring at it sometimes through her bedroom window, curiosity written all over her face. And honestly, I was curious too. The barn didn't look dangerous from the outside. It looked solid and well-maintained, just like everything else on the farm. The big doors were padlocked shut with a heavy chain, which seemed like overkill if it was really just about safety. Why lock an old barn so thoroughly? What were they keeping in there? I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that Margaret and Thomas had earned my trust over these past few weeks. They'd been nothing but kind and patient with us. They were giving us a home, a family, a future. I had no right to be suspicious of them just because they had one old barn they didn't want us going into. Every family had their quirks and their boundaries. This was theirs. But then one night, about a month after we'd arrived, I woke up to voices outside. I looked at the clock on my nightstand and it read 2:30 in the morning. I got out of bed and went to my window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out. The yard was dark except for a light coming from inside the barn. The doors were open and I could see Thomas moving around inside, carrying something. Margaret was there too, holding a lantern. They were talking in low voices, too quiet for me to hear what they were saying. I watched them for maybe 20 minutes. They seemed to be organizing things, moving boxes, checking on something. At one point, Thomas disappeared deeper into the barn, where I couldn't see him, and Margaret stood alone in the doorway, her shoulders slumped like she was carrying the weight of the world. When Thomas came back, he put his arm around her, and they stood there together for a long moment before closing up the barn again, replacing the padlock and walking back to the house. I climbed back into bed, my mind racing. What were they doing out there in the middle of the night? What was in that barn that required checking on at 2 in the morning? Maybe there were valuable antiques stored there, or important farm equipment. Maybe they were just organizing old family possessions and couldn't sleep. There could be 100 innocent explanations, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And despite my promise to stay away from the barn, despite everything Margaret and Thomas had done for us, I knew I was going to find out what they were hiding. Hey, if you're enjoying this story so far, I'd really love it if you could hit that subscribe button down below. It helps me keep bringing you stories like this one, and honestly, it means the world to know you're here with me on this journey. Also, drop a comment and tell me what you think is in that barn. Are Margaret and Thomas hiding something dangerous, something valuable, or is there a completely different explanation that we're not seeing yet? I love reading your theories and guesses. You guys always come up with ideas I never even thought of, and sometimes you're spot on. So let me know what you think is going on here. Now, let's get back to the story because things are about to get really interesting. I waited 3 more days before I made my move. 3 days of watching Margaret and Thomas, studying their routines, figuring out when they'd be far enough away from the barn that I could slip inside unnoticed. I felt guilty about it, like I was betraying the trust they'd been building with us. But the curiosity was eating me alive, and more than that, I needed to know if Emma and I were truly safe here. We'd been through too much to take anything at face value anymore. The opportunity came on a Saturday morning. Thomas had driven into town to pick up supplies from the feed store, a trip that usually took him at least 2 hours. Margaret was in the kitchen making bread, her hands deep in flour and dough, completely absorbed in her work. Emma was in the living room watching cartoons, and I told her I was going to take a walk around the property to clear my head. She barely looked up from the TV. I walked casually toward the tree line at first, like I was just exploring. But once I was out of sight of the house, I circled back toward the barn, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The padlock was still on the doors, heavy and imposing. I tugged on it experimentally, but it didn't budge. Of course it wouldn't. Thomas wasn't careless. I walked around the perimeter of the barn, looking for another way in. The windows were too high up and too small to climb through. But on the backside, hidden from view of the house, I found a section of wooden siding that had come loose at the bottom. The boards were old and weathered, and when I pulled on them, they gave way with a groan that made me freeze and look around nervously. Nobody came running. I was still alone. The gap was just barely big enough for me to squeeze through. I had to get down on my stomach and pull myself through the dirt, getting my jacket filthy in the process. Splinters caught at my clothes and hair, but I managed to wriggle inside. I stood up in the darkness of the barn, brushing myself off and waiting for my eyes to adjust. The barn was bigger than I'd expected. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls and roof, creating streaks of light in the dusty air. There were old farming tools hanging on the walls, rusted and ancient, bales of hay stacked in one corner, a tractor that looked like it hadn't run in decades. At first glance, it just looked like a normal old barn, full of the kind of stuff you'd expect to find. But then I noticed the newer items mixed in with the old. Boxes stacked along the far wall, sealed with packing tape, a camping stove, blankets folded neatly on top of a wooden crate, jugs of water, canned food arranged on makeshift shelves. It looked almost like someone had been preparing for an extended camping trip, or like they were stockpiling supplies for an emergency. I walked deeper into the barn, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards that Thomas had said were rotting. They seemed solid enough to me. I opened one of the boxes and found clothes inside, women's clothes, in sizes that would fit Margaret. Another box held men's clothes, another had medical supplies, bandages, prescription bottles with names I didn't recognize. In the back corner of the barn, partially hidden behind a stack of hay bales, I found a ladder leading up to the hayloft. I hesitated, looking up into the darkness above. This was already more snooping than I'd planned on doing. I should leave now, before I got caught, before I found something I didn't want to find. But I'd come this far. I needed to know what was up there. The ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed. The hayloft was darker than the main floor, with only one small window letting in light. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw what was up here, and my blood ran cold. The entire loft had been converted into a living space. There was a mattress on the floor with pillows and blankets, a battery-powered lamp, more supplies, more food, more water, books stacked against the wall, a small portable heater, and on the wall, pinned up with thumbtacks, were newspaper clippings, dozens of them. I moved closer, pulling out my phone and turning on the flashlight to read them. The headlines made my stomach turn. Local family missing after home invasion. Police search for Brennan couple in connection with assault. Fugitive pair still at large, considered dangerous. And there, in the accompanying photos, were Margaret and Thomas. Younger versions of them, maybe from 15 or 20 years ago, but definitely them. I started reading the articles, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. According to the news reports, Margaret and Thomas Brennan had been accused of assaulting a man who'd come to their property 20 years ago. The man claimed he'd been invited to look at a horse they were selling, but when he arrived, they'd attacked him, beaten him severely, and held him captive in their barn for 3 days before he managed to escape. He'd gone to the police, pressed charges, and Margaret and Thomas had fled before they could be arrested. There were more articles from over the years. Sightings reported in different states, the police investigation, speculation about where they'd gone, and then, more recently, articles about our parents' accident, about Emma and me being placed in the orphanage, and a small local paper's human interest story about 2 generous grandparents who'd come forward to adopt their orphaned grandchildren. I felt like I was going to be sick. This couldn't be real. Margaret and Thomas had been so kind to us. They'd given us a home, made us feel safe and wanted for the first time in months. But according to these articles, they were fugitives. They'd been on the run for 2 decades, and now they had Emma and me isolated on this farm, miles from the nearest town, with no one checking on us. Was that why they'd really wanted us? Not out of love or family obligation, but because we provided them with cover, a reason to stay in one place, to look like a normal family instead of criminals in hiding. Or worse, was there something else they wanted from us, something I didn't want to think about? I heard a sound from below and froze. Footsteps. Someone was in the barn. Natalie. It was Margaret's voice, soft and concerned. "Natalie, honey, are you in here? I saw you coming toward the barn from the kitchen window." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I was trapped up here in the loft. There was no other way down except the ladder, and Margaret was right there at the bottom. My phone was in my hand. I could call 911. But what would I say? That my grandparents who'd adopted me were wanted criminals? What if the articles were wrong? What if there was an explanation I didn't understand? Natalie, please answer me. Margaret's voice had an edge to it now, something that hadn't been there before. I know you found the articles. I know you know. Please come down so we can talk about this. I promise I can explain everything. I heard her climbing the ladder. I backed up against the far wall of the loft, my heart hammering. She appeared at the top of the ladder, and in the dim light, her face looked different than I'd ever seen it. Harder, older, tired in a way that went bone deep. You shouldn't have come in here, she said quietly. Thomas told you both to stay away. We weren't ready to tell you yet. We were waiting for the right time. Tell us what? My voice came out as a whisper. That you're fugitives, that you've been running from the law for 20 years, that everything you told us was a lie? Margaret shook her head slowly. Not a lie. Never a lie. We are your grandparents. We did lose touch with your mother. We did spend years searching for her. All of that was true. But the rest? I gestured at the newspaper clippings on the wall. The assault, the kidnapping, being on the run, that's all true too, isn't it? She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes glistening with tears in the dim light. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Yes, that's true too. But Natalie, you have to understand. You have to let me explain what really happened that night, because the newspapers, the police, they didn't tell the whole story. They didn't know the whole story. Margaret sat down on the edge of the mattress, her shoulders sagging like all the strength had left her body. She gestured for me to sit too, but I stayed standing, my back pressed against the wall, every muscle in my body coiled and ready to run if I needed to. She noticed, but didn't push it. Instead, she took a deep breath and started talking. The man who came to our property that night 20 years ago wasn't here to look at a horse, she began, her voice steady but filled with old pain. His name was Richard Caldwell, and he was your mother's husband. Her first husband, before she met your father. I felt my world tilt sideways. What? Mum was married before Dad? Margaret nodded slowly. She was 19 when she met Richard. He was older, charming, seemed like he had his life together. We didn't approve of the relationship. We thought she was too young, thought he was too controlling. But your mother was stubborn. She loved him, or thought she did. They got married against our wishes, and she moved out to be with him. That's when things started to fall apart. She paused, wiping at her eyes. Richard changed after the wedding. He became possessive, jealous, violent. Your mother called us one night, crying with bruises she tried to hide from us. We begged her to leave him, to come home. She said she would, that she was going to file for divorce. But Richard found out. He threatened her, said if she tried to leave, he'd hurt us. He'd burn down our farm, kill our animals, destroy everything we'd built. Your mother was terrified, not for herself, but for us. I wanted to interrupt, to ask questions, but something in Margaret's face told me I needed to let her finish. She was somewhere else now, lost in a memory that still haunted her after all these years. So your mother did something incredibly brave and incredibly reckless, Margaret continued. She faked her own death. She staged a car accident, left her identification in the burned vehicle and disappeared, changed her name, moved across the country, started over completely. She thought if Richard believed she was dead, he'd leave us alone. And for a while, it worked. He grieved or pretended to, and then he moved on with his life. But he figured it out, I said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. Margaret nodded. It took him 5 years, but he figured it out. He found evidence that your mother was still alive, tracked her to Ohio, where she'd been living under her new name. But before he went after her, he came here first. He showed up at our farm late one night, drunk and furious. He said he knew we'd helped her fake her death. He said we'd helped her make a fool of him, and now he was going to make us pay before he found her and made her pay too. She stood up and walked to the small window, looking out at nothing. He had a gun, Natalie. He held it to Thomas's head while I begged him not to shoot. He was ranting about how he was going to kill us both, then go find your mother and kill her too. He was completely unhinged. Thomas managed to get the gun away from him and we fought. It was messy and desperate and terrifying. Richard got hurt in the struggle. We didn't mean to hurt him badly, but he fell and hit his head on the corner of a tractor. He was bleeding and barely conscious. "Why didn't you call the police?" I asked. "We should have," Margaret said, turning back to face me. "We should have called for help right then, but we panicked. Richard kept saying that even if we turned him in, he'd tell everyone where your mother was. He'd make sure she was found. He'd destroy her new life. And we couldn't let that happen. We couldn't let him hurt our daughter." "So you kept him here," I said, the pieces falling into place. "You held him in the barn." "For 3 days," Margaret confirmed, shame written across her face. "We didn't know what else to do. We gave him food and water, we bandaged his head wound. We weren't trying to hurt him. We were just trying to figure out what to do, how to protect your mother without anyone getting in more trouble." But Richard escaped. He got loose and ran to the police, told them we'd attacked him unprovoked and held him captive. "We tried to explain about your mother, about his threats, about the gun he'd brought, but we had no proof of any of it. It was his word against ours." "And you ran," I said. "We ran," she agreed quietly, "because we knew we couldn't prove our story. We knew Richard would twist everything, make us look like the monsters, and if we went to trial, if all of this came out, your mother's new identity would be exposed. Richard would find her. So Thomas and I decided to disappear. We sold everything we could quickly, gathered what we needed, and we've been running ever since." I tried to process everything she was telling me. It was so much, too much. "Did Mom know? Did she know you were on the run because of her?" Margaret shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "We never told her. We never contacted her after we ran. We thought it was safer that way, that if the police were looking for us, they might monitor any attempts we made to reach her. We couldn't risk leading anyone to her door, so we just disappeared. We let her think we'd abandoned her, that we were angry about the mess she'd made. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Natalie, letting my daughter believe I didn't love her anymore. But you found her eventually," I said, thinking of the news articles about the accident. "Not until it was too late," Margaret whispered. "When we saw the article about the accident, about Jennifer Harris dying in that crash with her husband, we didn't make the connection at first. But then we saw your names listed as survivors, Natalie and Emma. Your mother had told us before everything fell apart that if she ever had daughters, she'd name them after her favorite aunts. That's when we knew. We'd found her, but we were too late. She was already gone." The silence that followed was heavy and painful. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. Part of me wanted to believe Margaret, wanted this story to be true, because it meant my grandparents weren't the monsters the newspapers made them out to be. But another part of me was scared and confused and overwhelmed. "Why bring us here?" I finally asked. "If you're fugitives, if you're in hiding, why risk everything to adopt us? We could have exposed you." "We still could." Margaret looked at me with such raw emotion that it took my breath away. "Because you're our family, Natalie. You and Emma are all we have left of our daughter. We failed her when she needed us most. We let fear and circumstances drive us apart. We weren't there for her when she was married to Richard, weren't there when she started her new life, weren't there for her children. But we can be here now. We can give you the home and the love that she would have wanted you to have. Even if it means risking our freedom, even if it means you might turn us in, you deserve to know that someone in this world loves you and wants you." I felt tears running down my own cheeks now. "The supplies," I said, gesturing around the loft. "All this stuff. You're preparing to run again, aren't you? In case someone figures out who you are." "We're always prepared to run," Margaret admitted. "We have been for 20 years. We have escape routes planned, false identities prepared, money hidden away. It's become second nature. But Natalie, I promise you, we will never run from you and Emma. If our past catches up with us, we'll face it. We'll turn ourselves in if we have to. But we'll make sure you girls are taken care of first. We'll make sure you're safe and placed with a family who will love you." I looked around the loft again, at all the evidence of a life spent hiding, running, looking over their shoulders. And I thought about the past month we'd spent on this farm, The way Thomas patiently taught me to care for the horses, the way Margaret braided Emma's hair and sang old songs while she cooked, the way they both listened to our stories about Mom and Dad with tears in their eyes, treasuring every detail we shared about the daughter they'd lost. They weren't perfect. They'd made mistakes, big ones. They'd broken the law, even if they'd done it to protect someone they loved. But they were also the first people in months who'd made us feel like we mattered, like we belonged somewhere. "Does Emma know any of this?" I asked. Margaret shook her head. "No. We were planning to tell you both when you were older, when you could better understand the complexity of it all. But now you know, and that choice is yours to make, Natalie. You can call the police right now if you want to. We won't stop you. Or you can let us explain everything to Emma together, and then you can both decide what you want to do. Either way, we'll accept your decision." I stood there in that dusty hayloft for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, weighing everything Margaret had told me against everything I'd read in those newspaper clippings. My phone was still in my hand. I could make one call and end all of this. The police would come, Margaret and Thomas would be arrested, and Emma and I would be right back where we started, alone in the system, waiting for someone to want us. Or I could choose to believe that sometimes people make terrible choices for the right reasons, that sometimes the world isn't as black and white as we want it to be, that sometimes family means standing by each other even when things are complicated and messy and scary. "I need to think," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "I need time to process all of this." Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Take all the time you need. But Natalie, please don't tell Emma yet. Not until you've decided how you want to handle this. She's still so young, and I don't want to frighten her." I climbed down the ladder on shaky legs, Margaret following behind me. When we emerged from the barn into the pale winter sunlight, Thomas was standing by his truck, unloading bags of feed. He took one look at our faces and knew immediately what had happened. He set down the bag he was carrying and walked over to us, his weathered face filled with resignation and sadness. "She found the loft," Margaret said quietly. Thomas nodded slowly, then looked at me. "I'm sorry, Natalie. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I'm sorry for all of it." I didn't know what to say to him, so I just walked back toward the house. Emma was still watching TV, completely oblivious to the fact that our entire world had just shifted on its axis again. I went upstairs to my room and closed the door, sitting on the bed that Margaret had made up so carefully for me, staring at the quilt she'd sewn with her own hands. For the next 2 days, I barely spoke to anyone. I went through the motions of daily life on the farm, doing my chores, going to school, sitting at the dinner table. But my mind was somewhere else entirely, constantly turning over everything I'd learned. Margaret and Thomas gave me space, but I could see the worry and fear in their eyes every time they looked at me. They were waiting for me to make my decision, to either accept them despite their past or to turn them in. I thought about calling Mrs. Patterson at the orphanage, asking her what to do, but I already knew what she'd say. She'd tell me to contact the authorities immediately. That's what any reasonable adult would tell me to do. But Mrs. Patterson hadn't seen the way Thomas smiled when Emma successfully saddled her first horse by herself. She hadn't tasted Margaret's apple pie or heard her tell stories about Mom when she was young. She hadn't felt what it was like to have a family again. On the 3rd day, I made my decision. I found Margaret in the kitchen, kneading bread like she did every Saturday morning. She looked up when I came in, flour dusting her hands, and hope mixed with fear in her eyes. "I'm not going to call the police," I said. She froze, her hands still buried in the dough. "You're not?" "No," I confirmed, "but I have conditions. First, I want you to tell Emma everything. Not right now, maybe not until she's a little older, but she deserves to know the truth about who you are and what happened. Second, I want you to promise that if your past catches up with you, you won't run. You'll face it and let the justice system work, whatever that means. And third, I want you to help me understand more about Mom. I want to know who she really was, not just the person she became after she disappeared. Tears were streaming down Margaret's face, but she was smiling through them. Yes, yes to all of it. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for giving us a chance. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind me. I turned to face him, and he looked older than I'd ever seen him, worn down by decades of running and hiding and fear. I have a condition for you too, I told him. I want you to teach me how to run this farm properly, because someday, when Emma and I are grown and you're too old to do it anymore, I want to keep it going. I want this place to stay in the family the way it's supposed to. He nodded, unable to speak, and pulled me into a hug. It was the first time he'd ever done that, and I realized it was the first time I'd let him. Margaret joined us, and we stood there in the kitchen together, this broken family trying to heal each other's wounds. That afternoon, I went out to the barn alone. I climbed up to the loft and looked at all the supplies Margaret and Thomas had stockpiled, all the evidence of lives lived in constant fear of being discovered, and I started taking it all down. The newspaper clippings came off the wall first. I folded them carefully and put them in a box, history that needed to be preserved but not displayed. Then I started organizing the supplies, the food and water and clothes and emergency equipment. Thomas found me up there as the sun was setting. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Repurposing," I said. "If you're not planning to run anymore, you don't need all this setup like an emergency bunker. We can donate most of the food to the church in town, the clothes too. The camping equipment can go in the garage where normal people keep it, and this loft can just be a loft again, full of hay and dust and farm stuff." He helped me carry boxes down the ladder. We worked in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that settles between people who understand each other. By the time we finished, the loft looked like it had probably looked for 100 years before Margaret and Thomas had turned it into their escape plan. Just an old barn loft on an old family farm. The months that followed weren't easy. There were moments when I'd catch Margaret staring out the window with a faraway look, probably thinking about all the years she'd lost with Mom. There were times when Thomas would jump at the sound of a car coming down the driveway, old instincts dying hard. And there were plenty of times when I'd lie awake at night wondering if I'd made the right choice, if I was being naive or stupid or reckless by protecting people who were technically criminals. But there were good moments too. Emma's 10th birthday party, where Margaret baked a 3-layer cake and invited half the kids from Emma's class. The day Thomas let me drive the tractor for the first time and told me I was doing great. The evening Margaret showed me Mum's old bedroom, preserved exactly as she'd left it, and let me take whatever I wanted to keep. The first time Emma called them Grandma and Grandpa without being prompted, and the way they both started crying happy tears. 6 months after I found the loft, on a warm spring evening, we were all sitting on the porch after dinner. Emma was playing with the barn cats, and Margaret was shelling peas, and Thomas was reading the newspaper. It was peaceful and normal, and everything I'd dreamed about during those long nights at the orphanage. "Natalie," Margaret said suddenly, setting down her bowl of peas, "I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, if you ever decide you need to tell the authorities about us, we'll understand. We won't be angry. You have to do what you think is right." I looked at her, this woman who'd sacrificed everything to protect her daughter and then sacrificed everything again to save her granddaughters. "I know," I said, "but I'm not going to. This is our family now. Whatever happens, we face it together." Thomas reached over and squeezed my hand. Emma ran up onto the porch, breathless and laughing, holding a tiny kitten. "Can we keep her?" she begged. "Please, I'll take care of her. I promise." Margaret smiled. "What do you think, Natalie? Should we add another member to this family?" I looked at Emma's hopeful face, at the tiny kitten purring in her arms, at Thomas and Margaret watching us with so much love in their eyes. "Yeah," I said. "I think we should." That night, after Emma had gone to bed with her new kitten curled up beside her, I went out to the barn one last time. I climbed up to the loft, now empty except for hay bales and farming equipment, and sat by the small window looking out at the farmhouse. Lights glowed in every window, warm and welcoming. Smoke curled from the chimney. It looked like home. It felt like home. I thought about everything that had happened, about all the secrets and lies and complicated truths that had brought us to this moment. Life wasn't simple. People weren't simple. Sometimes the right choice wasn't clear, and you just had to trust your gut and hope for the best. My grandparents had made mistakes, big ones, but they'd also given Emma and me something precious. A place to belong, a family to love us, a future that looked brighter than anything we dared to hope for during those dark months at St. Catherine's. Was it risky? Absolutely. Was it complicated? Beyond measure. But it was ours. And sometimes, that's all that matters. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you so much for being here with me. This community means everything, and I love sharing these stories with you. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider hitting that button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you content like this. But more importantly, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice about family? Have you ever discovered something that changed how you saw the people you loved? Share your story in the comments below. This community is built on shared experiences, and your stories matter just as much as the ones I tell. What did this story teach you about family, forgiveness, or second chances? Drop your thoughts down below. I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear what you think. Thank you again for being here, for listening, and for being part of this amazing community. Until next time, take care of each other.